haven't checked the weather yet, but I know it is the perfect day to chat about adult Jewish literature. I'm Cheryl Stahl. Thanks for joining me here at Nice Jewish Books. In January, the Association of Jewish Libraries announced their Jewish Fiction Awards. I had the pleasure of interviewing award winner Omer Friedlander and honor winner Rachel Berenbaum about their respective books, The Man Who Sold Air in the Holy Land and Atomic Anna. At the time, I was unable to connect with the other honor winner, GennaRose Nethercott, about her book, Thistlefoot. The good news is that she was able to participate in a session with the other winners at the most recent AJL conference. I'm happy to play the portion of the session in which she was interviewed by Fiction Award Committee member Hannah Srour-Zackon. At the end of the interview, you'll hear the voices of the other participants in the question-answer section. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to present GennaRose Nethercott with Hannah Srour-Zackon.
First, I just want to welcome GennaRose. I'm so excited to meet you and, put a face. And let's just dive right into it. So first off, could you tell us about your journey to this book?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My journey to this book there's like literal and figurative journeys, right? Where when I first started, I guess when I first found the seed of Thistlefoot, I was literally on a journey. My first book, The Lumberjack's Dove, which is a book-length poem inspired by New England folklore, had been selected for the National Poetry Series, and it was kind of my big break, and I wanted to do it upright. And for me, doing it upright meant going on an 8-month-long book tour with a puppet theater in the trunk of my car. I converted the trunk of my Honda Fit into a little camper. Yes, Honda Fits are very small cars, but I'm 5'2", so it kind of worked out. The headroom left a little something to be desired, but I converted the back into a bed. I had the puppet theater next to it, and then I was driving around the country for 8 months in a new town every 2 days, performing over 100 of these puppet shows that animated the book that I had written. And so while I was traveling, I became kind of obsessed with Baba Yaga's hut on chicken legs, sort of aspirationally, really. I was like, it would be better than the trunk of a Honda Fit, a house on chicken legs. And so I'm a folklorist in addition to being an author. And so I've been familiar with this particular piece of Slavic Eastern European folklore for a long time. And I always love moments where folklore that we think of as sort of antiquated or existing in the past chafes up against the present. It just kind of tickles me. And so I had this image in my head of Baba Yaga's hut on chicken legs. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Baba Yaga or Baba Yaga is a character from Russian Slavic folklore who's this kind of crone witch figure that lives in the woods in a house on chicken legs. And so I had this image in my head of this hut just hanging out in a Walgreens parking lot and scratching at a candy bar wrapper. And I just thought that was very funny. And so funny enough that I was like, I'm going to spend the next 3 years of my life obsessing over this one image. And that was essentially the first seed of the book. Thistlefoot is the story of Isaac and Bellatine Yaga, who are two contemporary Jewish American siblings in their early to mid 20s. And they inherit this house on chicken legs. In the world of this story, it blends this Slavic folklore with Jewish history and contemporary road trip stories. Isaac and Bellatine happen to be the descendants of Baba Yaga, and they take in this house and sort of madness ensues. But yeah, it was almost a write what you know book, which sounds insane if you've read the book, given that it's about traveling puppeteers who live in a chicken-legged house. But a lot of the book was reflecting, for one, my own life at the time. Isaac and Bellatine's kind of itinerant lifestyle is very much based on my own and those of members of my community. But then as they are traveling, they learn about the past, and we slip into the past in which my version of Baba Yaga is a young Jewish mother living in a shtetl in 1919 in the months leading up to a pogrom. And that version of the story is based on my own family's immigration story. So the shtetl in Thistlefoot is called GennaRose, which is a fictional name of a shtetl, but it's based on a real one called Rochnestrivka, which is where my own family came from. So everything that happens in GennaRose actually happened in Rochnestrivka. So yeah, it's kind of a smorgasbord of my life, my ancestors' lives, folklore, imagination, all kind of rolled up into one.
Wow, amazing. There's so much here I want to, dive more into, but there's one particular thing I want to go right into. And, like we discussed, as you've said, this book is just packed with fantastical elements and so much folklore and magical realism. But there's one character I would like to ask about in particular, which is Thistlefoot itself. How did you go about developing the character of and creating a living house?
Yeah, so Thistlefoot is what I named Baba Yaga's house on Chicken Legs. And for one, the name came from a really interesting place, which is in the folklore, traditionally, it doesn't have like a title, like a name. It is referred to, but usually just using words describing what it is, as opposed to being given a name. And I really wanted it to have a name, as a character would have. And so I kind of started by just thinking, what words do I like? Like, I'm going to have to use this name a lot, so I may as well like the word I have to say over and over again. And one of the first words that came to mind, I have this like Word document on my laptop of just like words I think are pretty. And I open this document and I'm looking through, I'm like, ooh, I don't know, plume, like azure. It's a very cheesy document, but thistle is in this list. And I was like, ooh, thistle's great, but wait a second, like, do they even have thistles in Russia? It wouldn't make any sense for me to name this house after a plant that didn't even exist as a native species in the place where the house was born, so to speak. So I looked it up, and it turns out not only are there very much thistles in Russia, but the specific breed of the Russian thistle, and if you've read Thistlefoot, you know this history because it's the prologue of the book, but the Russian thistle actually accidentally had seeds mixed in with a supply of flax seeds that were being carried by a group of Russian immigrants to the United States. When these immigrants arrived in the United States and they spread this flax seed around, the Russian thistle seed accidentally propagated as well. It became a rapidly growing invasive species, spread across the American West, and is known to this day by another name, which is tumbleweed. So when I discovered that, I lost my mind because I was like, this is an exact metaphor for the entire book that I plan to write. Thistlefoot is a story about, it's a story about stories, I suppose. It's a story about memory, and specifically what of ourselves is our own and what of ourselves are memories and histories and folktales that we may never even have been told. And so this history of the Russian thistle, which now we ubiquitously think of as such an American symbol, actually isn't American at all. And it is this diaspora plant coming from Russia. So that I got very excited about, and was the seed, no pun intended, of Thistlefoot's name. As for Thistlefoot's characterizing a living house, in my natural writing voice is a folktale voice. Like I said, I'm also a folklore ethnologist in addition to being an author. So I read a lot of folklore, and when I naturally storytell, it's kind of in a folklore teller's voice. So in certain ways, Thistlefoot is my own voice. It's a way to espouse my own philosophies on storytelling, on memory, and on lore, using a kind of separate mouthpiece. But I wanted Thistlefoot to be more Jewish, I guess, culturally than I am. I was raised pretty secular, even though my mother was raised in a very Jewish household. And I wanted Thistlefoot specifically, who came of I don't know if houses come of age, but whatever, in a shtetl to be very sort of rooted in that culture. So I read a lot of other Jewish writers who were writing in that same tradition. So Isaac Bashevis Singer, Sholem Aleichem, these short story writers who were creating these kind of Rai shtetl stories. And Thistlefoot's voice is a blend of those writers, my own voice, folktale tellers, that kind of classic gather around the campfire and I'll tell you a story voice. And it's also just like, what if memory could speak? A sort of literal if these walls could speak situation.
Wow, it's amazing. What I'm finding so interesting hearing you talk now, just how much of the personal is woven into the fabric of this story, which I think adds a real other layer to this fantastic book. Thinking back to when you were writing this book, did you encounter any challenges in this process, surprises, and was there any particular part of the writing that really stood out to you?
So if anyone's ever heard any interview with me ever, I famously hate writing. I would really rather be doing anything else with my time at all. Just truly anything. So in terms of challenging, it sucked. Writing this book was very hard and I was very miserable. But I'm very proud of it and I'm very glad I did it and I'm gonna do it again. I'm gonna just keep doing it again. So there was one particular chapter that stands out, which was labeled, I don't know if I shouldn't swear in this wholesome context, but it was labeled like this effing chapter. That was like the name of the document on my computer. And it was a chapter I just could not get right. I wrote it again and again and again. I like masticated this chapter to death. And it wasn't a chapter that was important, or it was important only in that it was a chapter that certain characters had to just tell some information to some other characters. And because of that, it was really hard for me to make it interesting because it was just passing information along. And I was like, that's not fun to read, or it's not engaging. And now I don't think a reader would be able to pick this out of a lineup, essentially, as being a more challenging chapter than any other. And I still thought it was a failure of a chapter. My editor, though, was like, look, when you're looking at this chapter, you're not actually seeing what it is. You are seeing all of the past versions of this chapter layered on top of it, and all the struggle that you have spent on this chapter layered on top of it. You're not actually seeing the chapter as it is. And I thought that was such good advice just for writing in general and drafting and editing in general, is that the book that I read when I read this book is a very different book than what exists on the page, because I'm seeing it layered with everything that came before and everything that it was. And like we were talking about with Atomic Anna, everything that was cut and left out, for better or for worse, I'm seeing all this richness there that may not have made it onto the page, but I'm also seeing all of these failures there that didn't make it onto the page either. So writing's hard, but it's worth it.
So actually building off this question, was there any folkloric tales or elements that lived in the back of your mind that didn't make it to the pages?
Oh, that's a good question. So in terms of the folklore, I mean, there's so much folklore here. And I tried to do a blend of both my own invented kind of fake lore, for lack of a better word, inspired by the tone and shape of these old folktales, mixed with actual folklore, both from Slavic history and from Jewish mythology. And so, there's certain elements that didn't make it on, that were chosen, though, to not make it in. Like, for example, with Baba Yaga folklore, there are many elements of Baba Yaga as a character that I chose to not include because it didn't necessarily fit with the story I was trying to tell and the philosophies I was trying to tease out. So, for example, she famously rides in a mortar and a pestle. Like, she sits in a mortar and she steers with a pestle. And that's a big thing in Baba Yaga folklore. I didn't need her riding around in a mortar and pestle. That wasn't necessary for me, so that's not in the story. There were certain other elements that I considered including, like, for example, in some Baba Yaga lore, there are 3 Babas Yaga, and there's 3 sisters. who live in different parts of the woods. And so for a while, I considered making this a story about three sisters, and then decided, no, distill it down, keep it more contained. Also, just in terms of the general mythology of the world that I built, the book is more magical realism than high fantasy. I really don't consider it to be a fantasy novel, even though that is how it is often advertised. For me, it's very much a magical realism novel in that it is just our own world with the volume knob turned slightly up. And what I mean by that is the only tangible difference between our world and the world that Thistlefoot inhabits is that in the world of Thistlefoot, trauma can physically alter a space or a body. And one of the ways that suffering can alter a space is that a house can come alive. Thistlefoot is not the only living house in this world. There are mentions of houses in New Orleans having sprouted gills during Hurricane Katrina, or houses on the West Coast filtering air during forest fires. Different ways that these homes have adapted in order to help the survival of their residents. And so something that I had wanted to make it into the book, but ultimately didn't fit, and I had written full chapters of that were cut, were stories in which the characters encountered other living houses during their travels that had morphed for other reasons. So yeah, that was kind of a mythology that would have been fun to explore more, but ultimately didn't serve the story I was trying to tell.
So I can see there's been some excitement in the chat about the puppet show that you mentioned. So I would love to jump back to that. And I'd love for you to tell us more about this puppet show that you bring along with you in doing readings of your novel.
Yeah, so in addition to the Lumberjack's Dove puppet show that I mentioned that I was traveling with when I first came up with Thistlefoot, I also travel with a puppet show in service of Thistlefoot. Thistlefoot, the main characters, Isaac and Bellatine, they were raised in a puppeteering family. They are puppeteers, and ultimately they transform the house into a mobile puppetry theater, which they travel across the United States performing from. I personally was raised as a touring professional child clown, which is just a whole, other bag of worms for another time. And I grew up traveling with my dad. This is not a punchline to a joke. This is like my real life. My dad is a clown and my mom is a therapist. And I'm what you get, I guess, when you put those things together. And so I really grew up touring. I grew up on the road. I grew up performing, and I really, really love it. So whenever I have a book come out, my most excited moment, as much as I hate the writing or the drafting process, I love the touring process. And I love when a story becomes a vehicle for connecting with the outside world and connecting with people I've never met. So what I do with Thistlefoot is I actually have this puppet show that I created in collaboration with a couple artist friends of mine, where there is what's called a cranky. Have you ever seen a cranky?
I have not, no.
No. So a cranky is this box, and it has two cranks on the top, and it contains a panoramic scroll. It's a big scroll that sits in the box, and when you turn a crank, the scroll pans across the screen, showing all this panning imagery. So I have multiple scrolls that animate chapters of the novel. I also have handheld puppets that interact with those scrolls. The scrolls are backlit, so it's a sort of shadow puppety thing, and they sit in a puppet theater that looks like a house on chicken legs. The structure of the book, for those who haven't read it, primarily follows Isaac and Bellatine on their travels, but it also slips into the past, and you hear stories of their ancestor Baba Yaga living in this shtetl. And the way that you hear these stories are in the form of folk tales told by the house itself. So it is these folk tales that are transformed into these puppet shows. I think did my 50th performance of this puppet show this week. I got back yesterday from a 2-week tour of the whole state of Nevada, where I did 11 shows in 7 days. I feel very insane right now. And so hello to you all with whatever energy is wafting off of my body. But yeah, it's a really cool show. I worked with one collaborator that was really exciting that I worked with is someone named Shoshana Bass, who is the daughter of, essentially she's the heiress to a puppet empire. Her parents, Eric and Inez, started this amazing Jewish-German puppet company called Sandglass Theater in the 1980s. She recently inherited it. What was really exciting for me about collaborating on this was, if you've read the novel, Isaac and Bellatine tour with a show called The Drowning Fool, which was their parents' sort of most famous puppet show that now they are performing. The Drowning Fool is very loosely inspired by, or at least the puppets in The Drowning Fool are inspired by, puppets from a production called Autumn Portraits, which was a Sandglass Theater production from, I think, the 80s and 90s, created by Eric Bass. And Shoshana, their daughter, has been performing those pieces recently. So when it came time to build puppets based on Thistlefoot, I went to Shoshana to build them. So it was this kind of full circle moment where the puppets in the book are inspired by Sandglass Theater puppets, and now the puppets I tour with are also built by Sandglass Theater. Yeah, and I also collaborated with an amazing artist named Maria Pugnetti, whose artist moniker is Woolly Mar, woolly like the sheep, M-A-R. I'll type both into the chat. So that if anyone wants to like follow them on Instagram or whatever, they both do amazing work. Maria is also a great DJ, also my roommate, and they're all just really talented. And yeah, so I travel all over the country. I kind of go wherever people pay me to go, honestly. If my flights are covered and my hotel is covered, like I'll show up wherever you want me.
Well, thank you so much. This was amazing. I think we're going to go now to spotlight all our authors at once and open up the floor to questions. So thank you so much. And like I said, I speak for everyone. I can see in the chat, everyone is putting saying in the chat, come to my city with your puppet show.
And it's worth noting that on my website, it's not updated right now. I'll update it soon. All my tour dates are always up there. So I do travel around a lot. I saw there was a New York request where I will be in New York doing my puppet show on July 25th, which is the day that the Thistlefoot paperback comes out. And I don't have any Texas gigs lined up right now. But yeah, I'm bopping around. I'll be in Columbus, Ohio soon. I'll be in at Bookstock in Woodstock, Vermont this weekend. And yeah, anyway, you can check my listings for Puppet Madness.
And I think a couple of folks have put links to videos of your puppet shows in the chat also. I think Heidi found some on your Instagram, is that right?
And yeah, there's some short clips, and also in service of the paperback coming out in July, we're going to release some like formally filmed, really nicely edited versions of the puppet show. So if you can't make it in person, those ones will actually be like we'll capture it nicely. And I assume they'll probably come out within the next few weeks.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. So July 25th, everybody write that date down. So while we look through for some of the questions that are in the chat, did the three of you have anything you wanted to ask each other? I promised you guys would have first crack at questions.
I mean, I always love to ask other writers for advice. I always love to ask them, what advice do you have for new writers or, writers trying to get to be better writers? Give me wisdom.
I feel like my trick whenever I'm stuck is just like gentle plagiarism. I mean, it's kind of old, cheesy advice, but like the more you read, the better you are at writing. But I think that you can take that to like a more direct level where, for example, if I'm trying to figure out how to pace something, if I'm like, when should I introduce this piece of information? Sometimes I'll go to a favorite book of mine, find the exact page where they introduced a similar piece of information and say, okay, I'm going to introduce this piece of information in my book on exactly the same page. And I think coming from poetry, it feels to me like following a form. Like if I was writing a sestina, it's more of a skeleton or a framework. And there's something about restriction of a framework that allows for more imaginative freedom. So wherever you can always find those frameworks in other books, and then kind of snatch a framework and use it to restrict yourself, which then kind of paradoxically expands yourself.
Yeah, I really like that. I guess I have a kind of follow-up more on the macro level. If you both used a kind of model of a book when you were writing your your novels, not only on the sentence level, but as a kind of structurally or something kind of on the bigger scale.
Thank you both. So a few things. First, GennaRose, Laura mentioned in the chat that the audio, she listened to the book on audio and the readers really brought it to life. And did you have any say in the narrator? I think so, right, Laura?
Yes. Okay. So the narrator, I cannot recommend the Thistlefoot audiobook highly enough. The narrator, January Lavoie, did an incredible job. She's been my favorite audiobook reader for years, and I basically groveled to try and get her to read Thistlefoot. I had originally found her, and this is actually kind of addressing Omar's question as well, which is, I come from poetry, so I felt very comfortable and natural in terms of like on a sentence level working, but structurally, I went for, like, I had some books that I referred to on a structural level to figure out how to like pace a plot. Because as a poet, I never had to pace a plot. And I was also a short story writer. Again, you don't really need to pace a plot in the same way as a novel. And so I was listening to January Lavoie reading this YA series I really love called The Diviners by Libba Bray. I really think that if you want to learn how to pace a plot in an engaging way, YA is an incredible resource because a YA book has to have an engaging enough plot to keep a teenager's attention. And so the plot is going to have to be airtight. And so, I was listening to January Lavoie read The Diviners and was using that both to structure Thistlefoot, but also just becoming obsessed with January Lavoie. So when it came time to do Thistlefoot, I specifically requested her, and she ended up actually being nominated for Best Female Narrator in the Audie Awards, which are kind of the audiobook equivalent to the Oscars. She nailed it. It's a beautiful audiobook, and I highly recommend listening to it if you're an audiobook person.
Thanks. I see Rachel said that Atomic Anna was also a fabulous listen with multiple narrators. Let's see. Chaim has a question for all three of you. Do you see the ending of the book when you start your writing?
Yes. Hi, I do. I see the ending and then it changes, right? So I know that I want to start here and I want to go right to here, to this other place. And I say, actually, I have a quote in Bend in the Stars where Baba Ethel says something like, just because you know the start and the end doesn't mean you know what's in the middle. And I feel like that middle, right, always takes me to a different ending. But if I don't start by writing towards something, I'm completely lost.
Anyone else want to jump in with that?
I don't really know, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. I think I kind of... it feels more exploratory, and then I kind of figure out where I'm going. And I think that works for stories. And with the novel, maybe I'll have to kind of use Rachel's approach.
And I try to know the ending. With Thistlefoot, the ending was the very first thing that I knew. And it had to be the momentum toward which everything moves. For short fiction, a process I really like, which I guess also doubles as writing advice, is I first try to identify what feeling I want the reader to feel when the story ends. Then from there, I think backwards to what ending would have to happen in order to create that emotion that I want them to feel. And then from there, think backwards again to what actions would have to happen in order to get to that ending, in order to get to that emotion. And theoretically, you can work your way all the way backward through the book using that method.
Great, thank you. And then here's a question for Omer from Linda. She says, stories need multiple endings. Did you choose the more difficult genre on purpose?
I don't know. I mean, I think I started writing the stories because it felt like I could finish a story more quickly than a novel. And I think it was important kind of early on to be able to finish something in terms of my writing. With a novel, I think can kind of, for years, it can be sort of in progress. But with a story, if you can actually finish it, then you can see the architecture of it. And kind of, I think it taught me something. And also I loved reading short stories. So I think that's mostly why I started writing them.
And again, Omer, Rena wants to know, can you speak about the characters in the Sephardi Survivor and the milieu you placed them in?
Yeah, it's kind of, kind of an absurdist story, but it's about these two kids who are Sephardi and they're jealous of their classmates who are Ashkenazi and have relatives that are survivors of the Shoah. And they decide to kidnap this old man and pretend he's their grandfather and he's a survivor. So it's a kind of absurd story. And it started with, I was with some friends in Brooklyn and Israelis, and one guy whose family is from Iraq, I think. He doesn't have any family that are Shoah survivors from Europe. And he said he was always jealous of his classmates. And I thought that was kind of strange. But also it made sense. And there's this kind of social cachet to it, I guess, in a kind of absurd way. And so I was interested in writing about it, but I think it's a subject that's very difficult to write about directly. And I needed to kind of find a way to do it. And I think humor is actually a way to sometimes tackle subjects which are difficult like that. And the character of the kind of, they have a nemesis in their school who's, his grandfather is like a big Holocaust historian, and they call him like the Elvis of the Holocaust. And he was kind of based on my grandfather, who's a Holocaust historian, and someone made a joke that he's kind of like the Elvis of the Holocaust. And so I kind of found a way of, I guess, writing about these things in a kind of absurdist way. That was the only way I could kind of address it. That makes sense.
Thank you. Rachel says that the Sephardi survivor reminded her a little of an Edgar Carrot story, but not as weird. Any last questions before we wrap up here? I don't see any left in the chat. No. Well, I really want to thank you, Omer, Rachel, GennaRose, for joining us today for such a great conversation. Everybody go out, read the books if you haven't done so already, get them for your libraries, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. Congratulations again on your awards. We all look forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you to the amazing members of the 2023 AGL Jewish Fiction Committee, Rena Citron, Sarah Feldman, Laura Schutzman, Hannah Srour-Zackon. Thanks to Dina Herbert, who's our incoming member. Thanks again to Dan Wyman Books for their generous support. And thanks to all of you for participating in AJL's digital conference, A World of Possibilities.
If you are interested in any of the books we discussed today, you can find them at your favorite physical or online bookstore or at your local library. Thanks to DeYankee for use of their Freilich, which definitely makes me happy. This podcast is a project of the Association of Jewish Libraries, and you can find it at jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks. If you would like to support this podcast, please click on the donate button in the top left corner of the podcast page or the link in the show notes. I would like to thank AJL and my podcast mentor, Heidi Rabinowitz. Keep listening for the promo for her latest episode of our sister podcast, The Book of Life, a show about Jewish kidlit, mostly.
Hi, I'm Arthur Levine, the founder and publisher of Levine Querido. I'm looking forward to talking to you on the Book of Life podcast, coming up soon. I'd like to dedicate this episode to the fight against book banning.
The Book of Life is the sister podcast of Nice Jewish Books. I'm your host, Heidi Rabinowitz, and I podcast about Jewish kidlit. Join me to hear my July 2023 conversation with Arthur Levine about Levine Querido.